Yeah, for the next several weeks, we are actually going to be going through the book of Ruth, one chapter at a time. And I think this is a wonderful narrative of all sorts of elements consisting of a beautiful love story, tragedies, celebrations, drama, romance. If you're waiting for the next Netflix Korean drama or love story in December, all you need to do is come to service to experience it all. Not only that, but Ruth is a fantastic book for those who are curious where God is in our lives. Especially within Ruth, we barely even hear the mention of God, if not see God visible throughout the text. Yet, this story is full of riches of God's grace and presence all throughout. It's a story for those who don't really expect anything to come out of the ordinary. And I hope we may all feel thoroughly encouraged and hopeful this long and dark winter we're entering as our final month of quarantine in 2020. So with that, our message for today is titled, God in the Dark, God in the Dark. Today we'll be looking at 3 scenes that shows us how God is working the darkest times of our lives. First, God is working in the darkness of our tragedies. God is working in the darkness of our tragedies. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. First and foremost, we see that the story takes place in the time of judges. And if we know anything about judges, right, we know that they were the authority placed during a 400-year reign when Israel was not yet ruled by kings. And although when judges, the judges were placed in positions of authority, it was actually a very dark time characterized by what was constantly repeated in Judges. In Judges, it's constantly repeated, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this kind of characterized the theme of Judges and what's going on in this time period. And this is the context that has been set place. It's in this dark and ruthless times, no pun intended, that it's a famine in the land, meaning there's a shortage, there's a lack of, it's deprived, it's empty. And for us in New England, at least in our lifetime here, I don't think we've ever experienced a famine. Maybe, you guys have to educate me. But the closest thing that we've experienced is maybe last March when there was a shortage or a famine of toilet paper due to the initial outbreak of COVID-19. It is here a man of Bethlehem is going to the country of Moab with his wife and 2 sons. And the irony here is Bethlehem means, right, it means the house of bread in Hebrew. It means the house of bread. Yet, this man, right, this man's house that we're talking about, it has no bread or no food. Yet he is still going to Moab. Moab, a place that is not predominantly like somewhere we would expect anyone to go, especially from Judah. And actually, the background that we have for Moab was during the ancient world. Moab was the son of Lot, who was exiled to Babylon for his arrogance and idolatry. And this is where the Moabites and Moab descend from. Why would a man of Judah, of Bethlehem, be traveling to a place like this? Well, despite all things said about Moab's arrogance and idolatry, Moab also means from the Father. Moab also means from the Father. So, it's the man of the house of bread who has no bread, who is going to Moab, which means from the Father, during this time of the famine. And this is one of the beautiful illustrations and nuances we see that God has orchestrated in these dark times, right? And there's a lot of these words that you got to kind of pay attention to, especially in Ruth, because there's so much symbolism that's going on here. Moving forward, this man's name was Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and the sons' names Mahlon and Chilion, and they are Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, Ephrathites which stem from the word Ephrath in Hebrew, which means fruitful. Right? Again, there's another term, Ephrath in Hebrew, which means fruitful. And this goes along the theme of house of bread and from the Father. And at least from our point of view, you could kind of look at these words and see that things are looking a little bit more promising. There's a lot of symbolism in the words that tells us that there might be good news in the nearby future. Yet, what happens? All of a sudden, Elimelech dies. He dies. And it doesn't end here. Mahlon and Chilion, the sons of Elimelech, at this point got married to Moabite wives named Orpah and Ruth. And after 10 years, the sons Mahlon and Chilion die as well. And although Elimelech was the main focus up until this point, the narrative focus shifts to Naomi. And it says at the end of this scene, she was left without her 2 sons and her husband. I mean, think about it. It's a disaster. It's a tragedy. What kind of situation is this? I mean, think about any Disney mother-in-law. This is like their worst nightmare. Imagine the evil queen from Snow White or Cinderella in this situation. Her husbands and sons, they just died. And there's a famine in the land. You know, this is not the American dream that they may have expected. And now what? She's got to care for her daughter-in-laws. She's a widow, especially in this culture. Being a widow, that has nothing to offer. You know, she's a widow who needs to care for her daughters that are not technically hers. And at this point, it doesn't really get any worse for Naomi. And if we were Naomi, we might be wondering, God, where are you? Where are you in this situation? Where is God in such a dark and heavy time? In this tragedy, in this disaster, where are you? And although Naomi has lost her husband and her children, left to be a widow with 2 daughter-in-laws from a foreign nation, you know, just like Naomi, we sometimes forget God's gift for us is wrapped up in an unusual way that we would never expect. Going along the theme of languages and names, Naomi is given Ruth. She's given Ruth. Ruth meaning a friend or a companion. We all know that Ruth, as Naomi's friend, is going to be God's instrument in these darkest of times, not only for Naomi, but for all of humanity. This should be a reminder to us all that God is working in the darkest of our tragedies. God is working in the darkest of our tragedies. Second, God is working in the darkest of our hopelessness. God is working in the darkest of our hopelessness. Next, we hear that the famine has cleared up. The Lord has visited his people and given them food. So Naomi gets Orpah and Ruth, her daughter-in-laws, and goes back to Judah. And here Naomi says something that we may not have expected. She says, "Go return, each of you, to your mother's house," meaning from where you've originally come from. "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." And there's a big scene where Naomi is telling her daughter-in-laws to go back. This is their one last chance to get out of this relationship, right? Their husbands are not even there anymore. It's their one last chance. And it's not that Naomi hates them, right? You know, they've actually spent more than 10 years together. And actually, if anything, Naomi still loves them because she says, "May the Lord deal kindly with you." And this is covenantal language. In other words, it's strong words of love coming from Naomi. They kiss each other and cry. And this is a very heartwarming scene that just illustrates how difficult it must have been for Naomi to ask her daughter-in-laws to go. You know, this must have been very hard for her. Because we all know Naomi, she's not the mother-in-law from Cinderella, nor is she the evil queen from Sleeping Beauty. She is from Judah, and she is a believer of God. That said, there is a dichotomy here, right? Because on one hand, Naomi is showing tons of covenantal love and care for her daughter-in-laws, yet on the other, she is dwelling in her hopelessness. She is dwelling in her hopelessness. And that's the dichotomy. Because once the daughters argue back and say, no, we will return with you, Naomi then says what? Do I have sons in my womb that may become your husbands? She says, turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they are grown? Again, what she's saying is she can't even bear kids at this point. She doesn't have a husband at this point. She has nothing to offer. And even though they've argued against her, they want to come, she's rejecting them. And this is how hopeless she is. Again, Naomi is showing so much covenantal love and care, yet her tone and her language, there's so much disparity and hopelessness. She's blunt. She's bitter. She's lost every sense of hope. And it's here, Naomi, she's at the end of her rope. She's done all she can. She's done her best to convince the daughter-in-laws to go and leave. She has given up on any sense of fruitfulness in her life. It is there Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and goes off to never be mentioned again in the Bible. And as Naomi thinks she's come to her conclusion, she's left all alone. It says Ruth clung on to her. It says Ruth clung on to her. As one daughter, Orpah, gave her a goodbye kiss, the other daughter, Ruth, clings to Naomi and says, for where you go, I will go, and where you launch, I will launch. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be remained. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts from me from you. And this is a beautiful and great illustration and demonstration of friendship and companionship displayed by Ruth. As Naomi thought she was showing this covenantal love, it's Ruth who actually counters with such a stronger statement, truly bringing a sense of hope. She brings a sense of hope and light to Naomi in her darkness and hopelessness. And you see, there's a friend I have, and it's for the story's sake, I'll call him Chris. Chris, a lot of times, he's a guy that's misunderstood. A lot of times, he thinks he's useless or he can't do anything for anybody and that there's no purpose for him. Yet, that said, Chris has one of the strongest gifts that he himself doesn't realize. And it's that he's the most loyal person I've ever met. He is so loyal that he's told me, he's like, Juni, if you ever do anything bad, like really bad, I'll still love you and follow you. And I told him, I'm very flattered by that, but of course, I want you to be accountable for me. Nonetheless, this is the type of loyalty he has. And Chris, he's a few years younger than me, and we've had this brother-to-brother relationship. And to me, a lot of times he feels like Ruth. He always says, I'll follow you wherever you go. I'll do whatever you ask, and he means it. I'm like, we've led mission trips together. I'm like, Chris, can you do this right now? And he'll be like, okay, yes. And he'll go and he'll figure it out in like 5 minutes. And he's more than useful. He's loyal and he's very caring. And you see, in some sense, Chris is like my Ruth. Because when I have nothing, and I've been in places where I felt like I can't depend upon anyone, and I felt hopeless, Chris was there at that time, and he's proved time and time to be on my side. And he's like my younger brother, and honestly, I love him so much. And the same way, this type of relationship Naomi and Ruth has, where sure, she's almost kind of blinded. Ruth is kind of almost even unsure about Naomi's faith, but she's like, I'll follow you. And the same way, God is with us. And I'm not saying God follows us blindly either, but he cares for us so deeply, even when we mess up and sin and when we're in the darkest of places. He's in our lives. And I'm sure he has given us all here somebody in our life. If not, he's given us Jesus Christ himself, who is that person to you, especially in your lowliness and your hopelessness. It's God who is working in the darkness of our hopelessness. It is God who is working in the darkness of our hopelessness. Third, God is working in the darkest of our miseries. God is working in the darkest of our miseries. So Naomi and Ruth, they go until they reach Bethlehem. And the whole town is stirred up. They're coming up to Naomi. It's been a while, and they're asking, "Is this really Naomi? It's been a while. She's back." It's like if you've come back from college after 4 years, if people recognize you or not. It's been more than 10 years, and I don't know if you've ever met somebody you haven't in a very long time. Maybe maybe there are some people here that's seen people after 10 years or 4 years or whatnot. But you have to realize within 10 or 4 or 20 years, people could change. And here Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly, very, very bitterly with me." For Mara means bitter. Because Naomi left with her husband, she left with 2 children, and a possible dream of fruitfulness, right? They went to Moab. It's this foreign nation. It's almost like this American dream that I imagine. And yet she's come back with what? Aged and with just her and her daughter-in-law. And again, you see Naomi's bitterness at this point. She's very blunt. She says, "Why call me Naomi?" Naomi means pleasant, actually. "Why call me that? But call me Mara," which means bitter. "The Lord has testified against me and has brought calamity upon me." And I think we see another dichotomy here of Naomi's understanding of God. She constantly says Lord with a capital L, and Almighty to prove that, yes, Naomi is a believer. But she only sees the misery in her life. She only sees the misery, the bitterness of her life. Naomi is only able to see what has been taken away from her. She's miserable. She's bitter at God because of the situation she's in. Her grief of her loss of her family tells her to see what God has, to not see what God has provided in her life as well. And what did Naomi just tell the whole town? And what did she just say when they came up to her? She says she came back empty-handed. She came back empty-handed. Yet, who's with her? Who's been by her side? Who's clung on to her, even when she said, "Go, I have nothing to give you"? It's Ruth. Ruth has been there the whole time, and she has shown such loyalty and covenantal love. Yet Naomi is only able to recall the misery and bitterness and the bad in her life. And many times, aren't we just the same? Something horrible happens in our lives. Maybe we lose a friend or a family member. Yet when God sends us people to cheer us up, or new friends or companions, we are way too bitter to see this. And I'm not saying what Naomi is going through is not understandable. It honestly makes a lot of sense to feel this way. Think about it. She lost her whole purpose in life, right? She's a widow. That's what women were in this culture. And she's lost her husband and her children, her offsprings. It's very understandable that she's feeling this. I'm not saying we can't grieve. I'm not saying Naomi can't grieve at all. But, we have to be, and I'm not saying we can't be honest. But in all of our misery, we have to also remember that God has gifted us everything else in our lives as well. We must remember in our misery, God is working. We must remember in our darkness, God is the light, and He has not left us or forsaken us. He loves us and cares for us so deeply. He understands our pain, our misery, and sorrow. And we got to remember that indeed God is working in the darkest of times. Because in reality, guys, we don't deserve anything that we have right now. Everything that we have right now, it should not be for us. We've not worked up or earned anything we have, the clothes, the food, the family and friends. In reality, we deserve the penalty of death. But nonetheless, God constantly redeems us and restores us and gives us, especially in our time of misery. He takes care of us. He takes care of you. And we see this because at the end of chapter 1, we finally arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest. And it's not a famine anymore. The famine has ended. Yet instead, it's a season of harvest where we will come to see the next part of God's plan for good news in Naomi's life and the rest of humanity in these dark time of Judges. Agape Church, let us remember, even when we fail to see God, God is working in the darkness of our misery. Even when we fail to see God, God is working in the darkness of our misery. So with that, we've come to our application. We've come to our application, and I want to give us 3 applications to this message. First and foremost, come before God in all honesty. Come before God in all honesty. To be honest, a lot of times when I read this passage, I personally relate to Naomi. And that's because she's a very human-like character. She's very raw and real and blunt about her situation. A lot of times at church, especially us Korean Americans, we're raised to look a certain way and to act a certain way. And sure, that's not always a bad thing. Some of these manners and things that we are taught are actually really good things about our culture. But when I was growing up, at least, I found myself being lost in who I was. And even now, I'm constantly dealing with this and asking myself, like, what do I actually believe in? Where is my heart? Because God wants us to come to Him as we are, right? He wants us to come to Him, naked and unashamed, in all honesty, because that's where He meets us. So I encourage you all, it's okay not to be okay. Come before God in all honesty. Second application. Open your eyes and see all of God's goodness and gifts in your life. Open your eyes and see all of God's goodness and gifts in your life. That said, a temptation is we may come before God, very honest, very blunt, and we may just stay there. It might just end there. And I've seen so many cases, myself included, where, we've been honest, we've been blunt and raw before God, but we dwell in our bitterness like Naomi. We're just dwelling in this bitterness, in our misery, in our darkness. And you see, coming before God in all honesty is only a first step. But the second step, the other part, is opening our eyes to the gifts and goodness that God has given us in our lives. And if we can't see it, honestly, that's our bad. That's our problem. Because, look, you and I, again, we don't deserve anything. We don't deserve a community. We deserve much worse than what we have right now. Right? This coronavirus, we should even be grateful. At the end of the day, we should be grateful that we could say that we're healthy and well. We don't deserve any kind of, we don't deserve any riches. We don't deserve any family. We don't deserve anything in life. It's only because of what God has given us. And He will give us the things we need. And He has given it to us, right? We could all look back 5 years from now and 5 years ago and say, God has taken care of us. God has taken care of me. And I'm sure, especially the parents here could say that as well. He has placed good people, friends, family, food, clothes, shelter, especially during this pandemic. Can we even be upset? Open your eyes and see all of God's goodness and gifts in your life. The last application is cling on to God like Ruth clung onto Naomi. Cling on to God like Ruth clung onto Naomi. What Ruth did to Naomi, it was something extraordinary and beautiful. This is a sort of loyalty and covenantal love that's not something that we see much today. That said, this is the only way we are able to exit any sort of darkness in our lives, any sort of misery, any sort of bitterness, or any of our tragedies or hopelessness. The only way we exit from that, the only way we could escape that, is when we cling on to God like Ruth clung on to Naomi. It's this type of faith that we have. It's when we cling onto this light in midst of this darkness, is when we cling onto God as God clings onto us. So church, please cling on to God. Cling to God like Ruth clung to Naomi. So with that, I want to end with this. Like I mentioned before, the truth of the matter is, Naomi's situation was very dark and it was very difficult. And I get it. I've said that when I've read Ruth, I relate to Naomi so much because it's so much easier to do what she did. It's so much easier to be in her situation, to cling to the darkness and not the light. The tragedies, the hopelessness, the miseries of our lives. It's so much easier to just dwell in that, right? All of us could say that. And if you're here and you've done that, or you're there as of now, let me say this. I hear you. I've done that too. And I get it. And you see, that's what the rest of our culture and world is going to constantly tell us to do. They're going to say, that's it. That's how it ends. Right? Look at Naomi. She couldn't get out of it. Well, what else is there to do? Who else could do anything? But we have to understand there was somebody who did. There was somebody who, in all his tragedies, hopelessness, and misery, was able to cling to God. There was somebody at one point who lost all his family and friends, who was betrayed, who was sold off, and yet he could have chosen the route of darkness, yet he decided to choose the light. Look, it's Jesus Christ himself, when he could have chosen to stay bitter and angry at everybody, at all of humanity, and even at God for his betrayal and his death, for his crucifixion. Right? This is the innocent Jesus we're talking about, who doesn't deserve any of this. He chose to swallow up the bitterness, to swallow up the darkness, and see God in the midst of that. And church, it's only when we cling onto Christ, right? It's only when we cling onto Christ and to cling onto that gospel, that aspect of the gospel, we too will be able to see God in the darkness as well. It's only when we cling to Christ as Christ clings to us that we too will be able to have the capability and strength to see God in the darkest of times. In these dark times, we need to look to Jesus because it's Christ, the one who did that first. So church, I encourage you, cling onto Jesus just like Ruth did. Just like Ruth did to Naomi. Jesus is our friend. Jesus is our companion. Jesus is a true and better Ruth. And it is only when we understand